and welcome to the channel Literature Simplified, where I explain English literature in simple English. Today we will discuss the significance and development of all the major and minor characters in the play All My Sons by Arthur Miller. For the students of BA in English Literature from IGNOU, this is subject code BEGC-105, Block 1, Unit 4. Let's talk about the major characters first. The play All My Sons has several important characters who drive the action, namely Joe Keller, Kate Keller, Chris Keller, Anne Deever, and George Deever. The first is Joe Keller. Critic Paul Bloomberg, in his article Work as Alienation in the Plays of Arthur Miller, says that Joe Keller's moral vision is very limited. It extends only as far as the fence around his factory or the neat lawn around his house. According to Bloomberg, Joe is not a cruel, selfish, or greedy businessman. Instead, he is an ignorant but good-hearted and kind man. His love for his wife and family is real and selfless. Joe Keller is the main character of the play. He is in his 60s and he is warm, friendly, and sociable. He built himself up from nothing. Though he had no formal education, he worked hard for 40 years and created a successful business. He started earning money from the age of 10, so he understands the value of money very well. He is not very intelligent and he often lacks good judgment. Even small things can surprise him. His values are traditional and based mainly on his own life experiences. He loves his sons deeply and feels proud to have them. However, after losing one son in the war, he sometimes wishes he had never had sons at all so that he would not have had to send them to war. The war changes his way of thinking. Keller enjoys fun and laughter. When he talks to children, he behaves almost like a child himself. He becomes friendly with Bert, an 8-year-old boy, the son of Frank and Lydia, his neighbors. The child likes him and he also likes the child. Keller is a devoted family man. He deeply cares for his wife Kate and he feels disturbed whenever she is upset. He worries when she has to work in the kitchen if the maid is absent. He is also anxious about Kate's strong belief that their missing son, Larry, is alive and will return one day. Joe doesn't want to interfere too much in Chris's choice of a bride because he believes marriage is a personal matter. However, he is worried that Kate will not accept Chris marrying Anne, who was Larry's fiancée and who still once believed Larry might return. Because he cares about Kate's feelings, Keller does not want Chris to marry Anne if Kate disapproves. But when he learns that Chris may leave home if Kate refuses to accept this marriage, then Keller becomes very anxious about the future of the business, the same business that he spent his whole life building. Even though Keller appears warm and friendly, he has a tragic flaw in his character. This flaw leads him to betray his business partner, Steve Deever. His neighbors know that he managed to escape punishment through manipulation, yet they accept him socially. Keller feels proud that over time his confidence, courage, and legal proof of innocence have helped people to forgive him. Chris admires his father for facing hard times bravely. He even jokingly says his father's name should be Joe McGuts because he sees him as a brave and strong man. That means that he thinks that his father had guts. That means bravery and strength. Keller is very pleased that he has regained the trust of the local people and of Chris, Kate, and Anne. He carefully hides the fact that he was involved in sending defective cylinder heads to the army just as much as Steve Deaver was. But Steve Deaver got imprisoned and Joe Keller managed to get away. Even after betraying Steve Deaver, Keller still shows concern for him. He asks George about Steve's health and whether he still has heart trouble. Keller says sympathetically, a little man makes a mistake and they hang him by the thumbs. The big one becomes an ambassador, referring to Deaver and himself, respectively. When Anne asks him if he holds any anger against her father for involving him in the defective cylinder case, Keller says he believes in forgiving and forgetting. He claims that he has no grudge against Steve. Perhaps to reduce his own guilt, Keller even wants to help Steve to rebuild his life once he is released from prison. When Chris confronts him, Keller is forced to tell the truth. He explains what happened in the case of the defective cylinder heads supplied to the army. He presents Steve Deever as the main person responsible. Joe says he sent the defective parts because he wanted to save himself and his family from bankruptcy. If he had thrown away the defective cylinder heads, the business he had built over 40 years would have collapsed instantly. Because he is ignorant and short sighted, he never imagined that the faulty engine parts would be installed in airplanes without proper checking before a report was sent to him. Keller is not a cold, greedy businessman who knowingly reduced safety to increase profit. Critic Dennis Welland writes that Miller presents Keller as a simple man who succeeded through hard work and determination, but who is not clever enough to fully understand how he succeeded. Welland also says that Keller does not have evil in him. Instead, he has small mindedness and moral short sightedness. He truly cannot imagine the public consequences of what, to him, was only a private business decision. Joe believes strongly in his duties as a father and a husband. He feels responsible for protecting his family's future. For him, nothing is more important than the family. The father son relationship stands above all relationships to him. Like many men, he cares about financial security and he works to ensure material comfort for his family. He does not think about the wider damage his actions may cause to society. His values are similar to those of many ordinary men in American capitalist society where business competition is intense and often ruthless. Because he is practical and realistic, he cannot meet the high moral expectations of his son Chris, who is an idealist. The letter written by Larry finally reveals the truth. Larry committed suicide by crashing his plane. He was ashamed of his father's involvement in fraud and war profiteering. Only then does Keller fully understand the terrible consequences of his actions. He realizes that he was responsible for the deaths of 21 pilots. He also understands that his crime cannot be forgiven. In the end, Keller sees suicide as the only way to repay his crime and to escape from his own guilt. He believes his death will also save Chris from further shame. Joe Keller's story ends tragically because he chooses his family's interests over the nation's interests. He's not a cruel or heartless villain. Instead, he's a flawed human being, someone the audience can understand, feel sympathy for, and perhaps even forgive. Next, we move on to Chris Keller. Chris is the son of Joe Keller. He is 32 years old. He's a strong and healthy man. He likes to stay informed about new books and regularly reads the book section of the newspaper, although he rarely ever buys any books. During the war, he was affectionately called Mother McKellar by the soldiers in his battalion because he was caring, kind, and sympathetic towards everyone. After returning home from the war as a hero, he begins working in his father's business. Chris does not socialize much with women. The only woman close to him is Anne Deever, who was his childhood neighbor. After receiving several letters from Anne, Chris believes that she wants to marry him and has completely moved on from Larry. However, he still wants to talk to her directly to remove any doubts before informing his mother about their plan to get married. Being straightforward and determined, Chris declares that he will leave his family home if his mother refuses to consent to his marriage to Anne. Chris is ready to stay with his parents and manage the business, provided his father supports his marriage to Anne. He knows that he must handle his mother patiently and carefully in order to persuade her. Kate's refusal to accept Larry's death becomes the main obstacle to Chris's marriage. However, critics point out that Chris also has selfish reasons for wanting his mother to accept Larry's death. As Stephen R. Santola observes, Chris wants Kate to face reality not entirely for her own good but partly so that he can marry Anne. Chris deeply loves Anne and becomes protective of her. Whenever Kate tries to discourage the marriage, Chris argues strongly in Anne's defense. Chris is an idealist. He feels guilty that he survived the war while many of his friends sacrificed their lives for what they believed was a noble cause. When he returns home, he is shocked that life continues as usual as if nothing significant has happened. He is disturbed by the ordinary routines and selfish pursuits of people who are focused only on making money. He feels that the soldiers' sacrifices were meaningless because the world has not improved. Chris even feels guilty about enjoying comforts and conveniences. He hesitates to fully accept the privileges of his life and even feels uneasy about marrying Anne. Sue Bayliss dislikes Chris because of the influence he has over her husband Jim. Chris encourages Jim to leave regular medical practice and to pursue medical research, which he sees as a higher and more meaningful calling. Sue accuses Chris of hypocrisy. She believes that he expects others to sacrifice comfort for principles, while he himself benefits from the money earned through his father's dishonest business. Chris loves his parents deeply and assures them that he will protect them if any trouble arises when George visits their home. His strong faith in his father prevents him from believing that Joe could be guilty, even though he vaguely senses that something may be wrong. He trusts that his father is innocent and he assumes that neighbors are falsely accusing him. Chris believes that Steve Deever wrongly blamed Joe. He is uncomfortable with his father showing too much sympathy towards Steve because it might create suspicion among others. Chris considers Steve a weak and timid man who not only supplied defective cylinder heads but also shifted the blame onto someone else. He thinks only George foolishly believes Steve's story. Chris also rejects astrology and refuses to accept his mother's belief that stars determine human destiny. Although Chris loves and respects his father, he is shattered when Joe finally admits his guilt. He had always seen his father as morally strong and incapable of any wrongdoing. He feels deeply ashamed when he hears his father justify his actions. As Paul Bloomberg points out, Chris is the complete opposite of Joe. While Joe's moral concern is limited to his family, Chris feels connected to the whole world and believes in a broader human responsibility. Chris is devastated that his father betrayed not only his business partner but also his country. While Chris was risking his life in the war and watching soldiers die daily, his father was making money through dishonest means. Chris feels that the selflessness of the soldiers meant nothing in such a society. He accuses his father of running a business that ignores the value of human life and deliberately endangers others for profit. Once Joe's guilt is fully exposed, Chris believes that the only other solution is to send his father to jail. However, Joe, unable to bear the guilt and wanting to protect his son from further humiliation, commits suicide by shooting himself. After his father's death, Chris feels responsible and blames himself for what has happened. Next, we move on to the character of Kate Keller. Kate Keller is Joe Keller's wife. She's kind, loving, and deeply motherly. Like her husband, she's warm, cheerful, and friendly with neighbors. Her maternal affection extends beyond her two sons to George and Anne Deever as well. However, she firmly believes that her son Larry, who was reported missing in World War II, is still alive and will eventually return home. She strongly opposes Chris marrying Anne because accepting that marriage would mean accepting Larry's death. And if Larry is truly dead, it would indirectly confirm Joe's guilt in the defective cylinder case. Kate's intense love for Larry prevents her from accepting his death. She lives in denial, using lies and deception to cope with her grief and suffering, as critic Stephen R. Santola observes. Her belief in astrology strengthens her hope. Frank tells her that Larry's horoscope showed the day he supposedly dies was actually a favorable day, and she clings to this idea as proof that he must still be alive. Kate uses superstition to convince others to believe that Larry is alive. She interprets events as signs. For instance, she connects Anne's arrival at their house with a storm that destroyed the apple tree planted in Larry's memory, seeing it as a meaningful sign. She also remembers suddenly seeing Larry's gloves for the first time after he left for war and considers that significant. On the day Larry left for battle, Kate woke up early without knowing he was leaving. She felt an inner warning that something terrible would happen. Later, she received news that Larry was missing in action. Even now, she believes that her instinct tells her Larry is still alive and that her belief is correct. Kate admires Anne's loyalty to Larry's memory. She thinks Anne is different from other girls who might easily forget their lover after his death. Kate believes that if Anne had truly accepted Larry's death, she would have already married somebody else in New York. Kate frequently argues with Anne and Chris, trying to convince them that Larry will return. Chris points out that she is probably the only woman in America still waiting for her son after 3 years. Kate believes that deep down, Anne must also still be waiting for Larry. However, Anne knows the truth that Larry committed suicide out of shame over his father's crime. Chris does not know about the suicide and he supports Anne, saying she is practical and not waiting for Larry. When Anne asks Kate why she is so sure Larry is alive, Kate explains her belief using religious logic. She says some things must happen, like the sun rising, and some things can never happen. This belief is connected to her faith in God. If there were no God, anything could happen. But because God exists, certain terrible things like a father killing his son can never happen. Kate believes her heart tells her what is possible and what is impossible. Kate was not happy about Anne visiting their home because neighbors are hostile towards Anne's father, Steve Deever, who was convicted in the cylinder case. She stops Chris from criticizing Steve and asks Anne not to blame her father. When Anne questions her, Kate insists that Steve's wrongdoing had nothing to do with Larry. Kate is aware of her husband's crime and fears that George's visit may bring trouble. She asks Chris to protect both her and Joe if any difficult situation arises. She wants George and Anne to leave quickly because she believes that they might destroy the Keller family out of anger. She knows that Steve had repeatedly claimed in court that Joe instructed him to ship the defective cylinder heads. Despite her anxiety, Kate still shows affection towards George. She prepares his favorite grape juice and reassures him that the Kellers still love him warmly. She even advises him to marry and promises that Joe would help him in his career and she herself would find him a suitable girl. During a conversation, Kate accidentally reveals that Joe had not been ill during the war, contradicting the false story used in court. Realizing her mistake, she quickly corrects herself, pretending it was only a slip of the tongue. Instead of urging Joe to confess honestly, Kate supports him in hiding the truth and covering up the crime. When Chris threatens to leave home and marry Anne, Kate tries to emotionally manipulate him to stop the marriage. As critic C.W.E. Bigsby notes, she uses her role as a mother to prevent a marriage that would destroy her hope of Larry's return. In desperation, she reveals Joe's guilt to Chris, saying that if Larry is dead, then his father is responsible for his death. She declares God does not let a son be killed by his father. Her indirect accusation forces Chris to confront Joe and demand the truth. After Chris storms out following the argument with Joe, Kate becomes anxious and restless. She feels helpless when she realizes that Jim Bayliss also knows Joe's secret. Understanding that the truth can no longer be hidden, she feels weak and powerless. Kate now urges Joe to confess and tell Chris he is ready to accept his punishment. She believes that if Joe shows willingness to go to prison, that Chris will forgive him. When Joe tries to justify his actions by saying he did it for his family, Kate rejects this excuse. She admits she wanted financial security, but not through dishonest means. Kate continues to refuse Chris and Anne's marriage despite their repeated requests. Finally, Anne produces Larry's letter, which reveals his suicide and exposes the truth. Kate is not shocked by the letter's contents because she had already known deep down that Joe was responsible for Larry's death. The letter forces her to accept both Larry's death and Joe's guilt in causing the deaths of 21 pilots. Even then, she tries to save Joe from prison by pleading with Chris not to go to the police. She argues that the war is over and that the letter no longer changes anything since Larry is already dead. When a gunshot is heard from inside the house, Kate understands that Joe has killed himself as punishment for his crime. Despite her own grief, she consoles Chris tenderly. She tells him not to blame himself for his father's death and encourages him to forget the past and begin a new life. The next character we move on to is Anne Deever. She is the daughter of Steve Deever, who is Joe Keller's former business partner. She appears in Act 1 of the play. Jim, Frank, and Joe describe her as beautiful and intelligent. She is 21 years old, gentle in appearance, but firm in her beliefs. Kate, Joe, and Chris all admire her beauty. When she sees her old house in the neighborhood, she feels nostalgic and remembers the happy childhood she spent there with her family. Anne comes to the Keller household with the intention of marrying Chris. As A. Karunakar observes, she arrives with a purpose, that is to rescue Chris from a morally troubled family still haunted by Larry's memory. For Joe Keller, however, Anne represents the past and poses a threat because she may reveal the truth about the defective cylinder case. Anne is not waiting for Larry to return. Since he has been missing for a long time, she assumes that he's dead. Through letters exchanged with Chris, they have fallen in love. She comes to the Keller household at Chris's invitation so that he can formally propose marriage to her. She firmly rejects Kate's belief that Larry is still alive. After arriving at the Keller home, Anne feels uncomfortable and even considers leaving because Kate does not want her to stay and Chris initially appears uneasy. However, once Chris openly declares his love and proposes marriage, she feels reassured. When Chris explains that he felt ashamed to love her because of the tragedy around them and that he felt guilty enjoying comfort and wealth, Anne helps him to overcome that guilt. She tells him that he has the right to live his life and use the money his father earned for him. Anne shares Chris's idealism and moral seriousness. After her father Steve was convicted for supplying defective cylinder heads, she completely disowns him and refuses to visit him in jail. When asked about her father, she feels uncomfortable and avoids discussing him. She admits that she cried when he was imprisoned, but when she later learned that Larry died because of those defective cylinders, she understood the seriousness of the crime. She speaks harshly about her father, saying, "Father or no father, there was only one way of looking at him." When Keller tells her that her father cried half the night after hearing about Larry's death, Anne responds coldly that he should have cried the entire night. She even tells Chris that he is lucky to still be able to love his parents. When George accuses Keller of fraud, Anne defends the Kellers by pointing out that the court declared Joe innocent. She claims that her father lied. She strongly disagrees with George when he says that everything the Keller family owns is gained dishonestly. Her defense of the Kellers may partly arise from her love for Chris, whom she wants to marry. Although she knows important facts about the case, she hides the truth to prevent any obstacle to her marriage. Anne is surprised by Keller's concern for her father. Joe even offers to help Steve start a new life after completing his prison sentence. Anne notices this sympathy. She is impressed by Chris's honesty and idealism. She believes he does nothing wrong by inspiring Jim to aim higher in life. In her view, if Chris uses his father's money, he is also helping his father in business. Anne feels embarrassed to face the neighbors because she remembers them calling her family murderers. She does not want to experience that kind of humiliation again. She trusts Joe Keller and refuses to believe Sue's suggestion that Joe was guilty. She also believes that if Chris had known about his father's involvement, he would not have forgiven him, and trusts Chris as completely as Chris trusts his father. Anne patiently tries to persuade Kate to accept her marriage to Chris and to stop believing that Larry is alive. She explains that she intends to show Larry's letter not to hurt Kate but to prove that Larry is dead. The letter reveals that Larry committed suicide out of shame after discovering his father's involvement in killing the pilots. Anne had known from the letter that Joe was as guilty as her own father. Yet, she kept silent because she desperately wanted to marry Chris. She does not want to destroy the Keller family by exposing Joe. As Stephen R. Santola notes, she only reveals the truth when she is forced to do so in order to save her relationship with Chris. Her actions are partly selfish, driven by self preservation. Feeling insecure and without support, Anne seeks love and stability in the Keller household. She tells Chris she has nowhere else to go and will follow him wherever he chooses. In the end, she clears the path for their marriage without demanding that Chris turn his father over to the authorities. Now we move on to George Deever, who is the last of the major characters. George Deever is Steve Deaver's son. He's a lawyer and a World War II veteran. He comes to Keller's house after visiting his father in prison in Columbus, Ohio. Initially, George is disgusted with his father and distances himself from him because of the shame of the crime. However, after meeting his father in prison, he learns what he believes is the truth about Keller's deceit. He regrets not having visited his father earlier after returning from war. George arrives at the Keller house determined to stop Anne from marrying Chris and to take her back to New York. George's visit creates fear and anxiety in Joe and Kate. Joe worries that George might reopen the case and send him to prison. Since Steve had repeatedly accused Joe during the trial, George's sudden visit raises suspicion about his intentions. George functions as a catalyst in the play. His presence pushes hidden truths closer to the surface. Kate is also suspicious. She finds it strange that George, who had not written to his father for 3 years, suddenly visits him in prison after becoming a lawyer. George questions Anne, asking whether she would still marry Chris if she knew the truth about Joe Keller's clever manipulation. He accuses Keller of promising on the phone to take responsibility for shipping the defective cylinder heads and later denying it during the trial, knowing that the phone conversation could not be legally proved. George accuses Chris of pretending ignorance about his father's fraud. He also blames Kate for hiding the truth. However, Anne defends Keller and dismisses her father's accusations as lies. Anne refuses to return to New York with George unless Chris himself asks her to leave. George argues forcefully with Chris but fails to convince him of Joe's guilt. Although George is angry, he behaves tactfully at first. He speaks calmly to Keller and even asks about his business. However, when Keller expresses sympathy for Steve, George becomes furious and says his father hates Keller deeply. Yet George is gradually softened by Keller's humor and Kate's kindness. He remembers the happy childhood days when the Deavers and the Kellers lived closely and warmly together. For a moment, he almost seems ready to accept Keller's version of events. However, Kate accidentally reveals the truth by saying that Joe had not been ill in 15 years, contradicting the defense used during the trial. This confirms what Steve had told George. Although George does not directly expose Keller, his visit increases tension among all the characters. George is blunt in his behavior. When Sue invites him to see the house his family once owned, he responds coldly, saying that he preferred it the way it was. When he notices the stump of the apple tree planted in Larry's memory, he sarcastically asks whether they are afraid of forgetting him. Through such remarks, George expresses bitterness, suspicion, and emotional distance. So, those were all the major characters. Now, we will move on to the minor characters. The minor characters are Dr. Jim Bayliss, Sue Bayliss, Frank Luby, Lydia Lubey, and Bert. They serve the purpose of helping to move the action forward. They comment on the main characters, deepen the central themes, and add moments of humor to what is otherwise a serious and tragic play. First, we'll talk about Dr. Jim Bayliss. He is Sue's husband and a close friend and neighbor of Joe Keller. Although he's a doctor, he does not want his son to follow in the same profession because he believes doctors do not earn as much money as film actors. His sarcastic remark that he would love to help humanity on a Warner Brothers salary shows his dissatisfaction with the financial limitation of his profession. Jim does not believe in astrology. He openly mocks Frank's attempt to determine Larry's fate by reading his horoscope. Frank, in turn, considers Jim a man who does not want to believe in anything. Jim knows his wife is very concerned about money. He jokingly advises Anne that after marriage, she should never calculate her husband's earnings. Chris speaks highly of Jim in his letters to Anne, and Jim is equally fond of Chris. He tells Anne that Chris was affectionately called Mother McKellar in the army because of his kindness. Although Jim suspects that Joe Keller may be guilty as Steve Deever, he still likes the Keller family. He tries to protect them from George's accusations and from a direct confrontation with the truth. As critic Stephen R. Santola explains, Jim shields the family, especially Chris, because he wants to preserve the illusion of their moral integrity. Jim himself feels that the star of his own honesty has faded. If Chris's ideal image is destroyed, Jim fears that he will lose the reminder of the kind of man he once wanted to be. Like others in the play, Jim lives partly in denial. When George arrives angry and upset, Jim wisely keeps him seated in the car parked away from the house. He warns Chris that George is furious and may lose control. Jim fears violence and does not want Kate, who is unwell, to witness any outburst. After Chris storms out of the house, Jim confronts Kate and assures her that Chris will return. He understands Chris's idealistic nature and believes it will take some time for him to accept the painful truth about his father. Jim himself once tried to follow his idealism by leaving home to pursue medical research, but he returned because his wife preferred financial security and comfort. The next minor character is Sue Bayliss. Sue Bayliss is Jim's wife and she is about 40 years old. She is practical, lively, and keeps a close watch on her husband. She supported him financially during his internship and now she expects more than simple gratitude in return. Sue is aware of Joe Keller's suspected guilt and she knows that the neighbors believe he manipulated the court to secure his acquittal. Yet, she and Jim remain friendly with the Kellers. As noted in Arthur Miller's collected plays, Sue even admires Keller for cleverly escaping punishment. Sue is straightforward and outspoken. She complains to Anne that her husband refused to take her to the beach because of the heat, yet he went to the airport to receive George. She sarcastically remarks that men will do favors for neighbors but not for their wives. She's curious about whether George is coming to give Anne away in marriage. Sue believes Anne has chosen Chris partly because he is financially secure. For her, money is extremely important. Sue strongly resents Chris's influence over Jim. She believes that Chris encourages Jim to leave medical practice for research, which would reduce their income and lifestyle comforts. According to Sue, every time Jim talks to Chris, he feels guilty for not pursuing idealistic research. Sue believes that everyone does something wrong in life and that people must accept practical realities. She shares Keller's belief in prioritizing family responsibility. Sue accuses Chris of hypocrisy. She says he enjoys wealth earned through his father's dishonest business while preaching moral ideals to others. If Chris wants people to sacrifice comfort for principles, she argues he should begin with himself. She dislikes both Chris and Joe for what she sees as their exaggerated sense of moral superiority. Now we move on to the character Frank Lubey. Frank Lubey is Lydia's husband and another neighbor of the Kellers. He is 32 years old and already balding. Like Keller, he is practical and he has made money through property dealings. Frank avoids reading newspapers because he believes that they only carry bad news. Unlike Jim, he firmly believes in astrology. By insisting that Larry's horoscope proves he is alive, Frank unintentionally strengthens Kate's denial. Frank also interprets the fallen apple tree planted in Larry's memory as having symbolic meaning. His superstitious nature contrasts with Jim's skepticism. Lydia praises Frank for being skilled at repairing appliances, and Sue jokingly calls him Thomas Edison. Frank believes medicine is an honorable profession because doctors serve humanity. He also feels that in cases like Steve Deaver's, the law should either fully punish or release the accused instead of prolonging imprisonment. During the war, while George, Chris, and Larry were fighting, Frank stayed behind. He narrowly missed military service due to age limit changes. After that, he returned to astrology. He married Lydia and built a family with 3 children. The next character is Lydia Lubey. Lydia is described as a cheerful and attractive woman. She is warm, affectionate, and lively. George fondly calls her Laffy. Before the war, Lydia was George's girlfriend. However, when George went to war and later distanced himself after his father's imprisonment, she married Frank. When George returns and confronts the Kellers, he realizes he has lost not only his father's honor, but also Lydia and the stable life he might have had. And the last character we come to is Bert. Bert is the 8-year-old son of Frank and Lydia. He is friendly with Joe Keller. Joe jokingly tells Bert that there is a jail in his basement, which irritates Kate. They often play games in which Joe pretends to be a police officer and Bert acts as a policeman guarding the neighborhood. This playful image ironically reflects the larger theme of guilt and hidden crime within the Keller household. And with that, we come to the end of this video, and it completes the study of the play All My Sons. Please check out the other videos in the playlist for videos on American literature, and I'll see you in the next video.